Our story of the day comes from the prophet Amos, chapters 1 and 5. The words of Amos, who was among the shepherds of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of King Uzziah of Judah and the days of King Jeroboam, son of Joash of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. And he said, "The Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds wither and the top of Carmel dries up. Seek good and not evil, that you may live. And so the Lord, the God of hosts, will be with you, just as you have said. Hate evil and love good, and establish justice in the gate. It may be that the Lord, the God of hosts, will be gracious to the remnant of Joseph. I despise your festivals. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. The offerings of well-being of your fatted animals I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." This is God's story for us today. Thanks be to God. I want you to imagine that you had someone who you were, not yet. Yeah. It's okay. I want you to imagine that you had someone in your life that you were very close to. Maybe it was a partner, spouse, or a best friend. And this person always did such great things for you. You had a great relationship. You could tell them anything, and you felt good in their presence. And every so often, this person would bring you flowers. Now, you didn't necessarily ask for flowers or even particularly love flowers more than anything else, but you knew it was from them a token of their love for you. And every time you walked by your table or wherever you put the flowers, you would think of that person, and it represented the good relationship you had. And so the flowers became more meaningful because of the relationship. Now imagine that same person, that this was somebody who, maybe over time it changed, but you didn't feel good with them. They belittled you. They said harsh words. Maybe they even betrayed you or hurt you somehow. And when you confronted them, they apologized and gave you flowers, but then they continued to do the same thing. They continued to berate you and made you feel stupid, made you feel bad. You heard about things they said about you, and the relationship was tarnished, but they always tried to give you flowers. After a while, when you walked by and saw those flowers, even if they were your favorite, you'd hate them because they represented that painful relationship. When Amos is coming to the people of Israel, Amos is speaking mostly to the leadership. Most of the prophets were coming to speak to those in power, because there have always been those in power, whether it was the kings and all the people who lived in the castle and the well-off, as well as the priests. And there are always those who were not well off. And as someone said, the prophets always showed up when you could tell that there was a greater disparity between those who did and did not have. And Amos says, you come on the Sabbath to the temple and you offer all these things to God. That is like bringing God flowers. But then the whole rest of the week you turn around and treat the other children of God very poorly. And as Jesus says in Matthew 25, what you did to the least of them, you did to me. So we can't say we love God and then hate our neighbor. We cannot come to worship and give our best to God and talk about how much we love God and then go out and treat our neighbor poorly. And some of this is just in very, very basic ways. It was that there were those who would hire people and not give them fair wages. We know that oftentimes the kings might use slave labor of the people to build things. Maybe they were even forced to work on the Sabbath. Whatever it was, the people were not being treated as they should be. And it was as if they were treating God in that way. As I mentioned a couple weeks ago, one of the things that I think would help us a great deal as a Christian church is to add the theology of the heart to the mix. And it's not a new idea, but it is bringing in that focus of relationship to God, to ourselves, and to neighbor. Love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, and mind, and your neighbor as yourself. That threefold relationship not only is important, but it's inextricable from each other. You cannot separate them. Because the way we love our neighbor or don't love our neighbor is as much as we love God. As hard as it is to hear that. We have been told in this country many things. We have been told that we are different as a people. We have been told that anyone can make a good life for themselves, and therefore cries for justice, cries at unfairness are just people being victims, maybe. We have been told that certain groups of people are dangerous, that certain groups of people are less. And the sad thing that I've learned is even if you believe that, don't believe that with your mind, there's something in our culture that still gets in there. And when I've really searched my thoughts, I have found things I didn't want to be there, things that were deeply sexist or deeply racist. I don't know how they got in there, but they did. We have been told, and we continue to be told, you hear messages every week of people who get up and say, these are the people we should be afraid of. These are your enemies, right? And so we get divided, and we never really have the chance to come together and speak about what is true justice and true goodness for all people. One of the things that's hard for us is because there's so many loud voices, that these issues, which are really issues of the human heart and of fairness, can be politicized. And so we start talking about treating our neighbors fairly and justice, and we think, well, what is this, politics? No, this is the Bible. God's way is that all people are children of God. God's way is that all people are worthy. God's way is that everyone is a complicated sinner and saint, meaning we're not going to like everybody. We're not going to like everybody, and there are some people who do bad things, but it doesn't mean that we dehumanize them and that we exclude them from a world that is more just. I was reading a book called Braiding Sweetgrass this week, and it reclarified something about trees for me. You see, the indigenous peoples long ago believed that trees spoke to each other through the wind. And then the scientists came along and said, well, that's stupid. Trees don't talk. They don't even bark. There's no way they can communicate. Right? Animals, we know they sort of communicate, but we have neglected and underestimated animals' ability to communicate with each other. But trees, what can they do? Well, guess what? Now scientists are discovering that the indigenous people were correct. That trees can send pheromones through the wind to other trees to warn them about possible danger. And underneath the ground, there are networks of roots and the fungi that connect the trees that exchange information and exchange nutrients. So all of the trees are nourished. They work as a community and as a family. And they work best in diversity too. So the elm and the oak and the maple and the birch all see each other as family and are connected underground, feeding each other information and resources. And we finally just figured out then that when we go out and see a bunch of trees, we're seeing families that communicate with each other. We just never knew the language. What's also interesting is that they've noticed that when they clear-cut trees, and often what they do is plant monocultures, the same tree in rows, and we've seen that, right? Where they'll have a whole bunch of fir trees in a row. And they notice they behave differently, and they don't know why, that some of them will die and some of them will thrive. Well, scientists are now discovering that because these trees didn't grow up in the forest in a family, but they grew up in a nursery, they never learned how to be a family. Disconnected from the original instructions, they all act kind of like capitalists. They compete for the sunshine. They compete for nutrients, and some win and some lose, and that doesn't happen in the forest. Maybe the trees know something we have forgotten as humans, that we were born connected, and that our future is dependent on everyone's success. That we have built into us the ability to share so that everyone gets what they need, and that the diversity of one another actually makes us stronger against, for trees speaking, diseases and other sorts of things. They're able to pass on knowledge because they're different. Isn't that beautiful? What justice is not just being really nice in this world. It's okay to be nice, it's good to be nice, but sometimes when we try to be nice, we can pretend everything is fine. And we think if we just smile at everybody we meet in our life, that now the world's going to be okay. But it often neglects deep issues. If we had outside of our church 8 or 9 steps coming up to the front door, and that was your only way to get in, we can smile at absolutely every person that comes to the church, but not all of them are going to be able to come in and worship. Is that just? We were being nice. But I think what the person who would want to come to church would rather have is an easy way to get into the church that didn't involve going up 8 steps. Justice is not revenge. In our culture, we hear a lot about justice, and sometimes those words end up being about punishment and cruelty and watching someone suffer because you suffered. That is not justice in God's eyes. Justice has consequences. But justice is ultimately about bringing everyone back into community, into relationship with one another, as well as with God. And that may involve really, truly listening and repenting and massively changing the way we think about things and the way we do things so that others can feel invited into that space. It is loving your neighbor on a larger scale. It is treating your neighbors well, but also making sure the neighbors who are strangers to us have what they need. It is believing people, listening, being creative, trying, failing, starting again to build a better world. And justice at times means binding the powers that have a lot of power and forcing them to be responsible and accountable, and loosing those who have been bound to be more free in the world. Binding those with power and loosing those without. So when Amos comes to talk to the people of Israel, he finds a world that's very disconnected from this idea of love and justice and shalom. And I think Amos has things to teach us as well today. That when we come to worship, we're bringing flowers to God, metaphorically. And so when we go in the world, how do we participate in bringing God's vision of the world to the earth in the way that we can? Finally, I recently connected with a woman from Tanzania, and we spoke a little bit, and she started a nonprofit in Tanzania called Tuko Sawa, which in Swahili means we are okay, we are all equal. It also means to see oneself in the other. And their goal is to teach young people about environmental conservation and climate change, to empower them locally, to empower these kids. Because they believe that they all have answers, and if they come together, they can be better together, that they know something that they can share. They also believe that the creation is our neighbor too, a neighbor that can speak, just not always in language we can understand. And so sometimes our justice is also for our neighbor, the earth and the animals and the water and the air. To see oneself in the other, or maybe to see God in the other. When we can do that, we are truly worshiping God with our whole lives. We'll take a moment now to just ponder what we think justice looks like if this world were as God would want it.